Now, this video is probably going to end up a bit more candid and long-winded than usual, more just me throwing some thoughts and ideas out there to ultimately hear what you all think about this topic in the comments below. And so what I'm going to do is just jump right into it with a Mark Hamill quote, one taken from the new book, Howard Kazanjian, A Producer's Life, written by the late, great J.W. Rinzler. Anyway, Mark Hamill had this to say. I was impressed the prequels had their own identity. They were criticized because they were exposition heavy and more cerebral, and probably, like he said back in 1976, they weren't as commercial. It's a darker story, but in the age of social media, people's voices are amplified, and I'm shocked at how brutal they can be, not just in the case of Star Wars films, but across the board. Okay, so even though there's a couple different things we could get into or discuss here, the first one and the main one that I want to talk about is what he said about social media and relate it to the prequel hate, and also how it amplifies voices, which I think is absolutely true, speaking of social media. In fact, I've said before that perhaps the best thing about the internet is it gives everyone a voice, yet at the same time, perhaps the worst thing about the internet is that it gives everyone a voice. Basically meaning, like with a lot of things in the world, it all comes down to how it is used, and for all the good and conveniences the internet provides, there are certainly all kinds of dark sides to it as well, not the least of which is the incessant arguing on social media, and people spewing all sorts of hate at each other over any number of issues or topics, to the point where we, at least, feel more divided than we ever have before, and even over things like Star Wars, though many will say that's been going on, there's been a huge divide since the prequels. But what's kind of interesting to point out is that the Star Wars prequels, of course, did come out during the age of the internet. I mean, I still remember it taking hours back in 1999 to download a high-res 480 DVD quality of the teaser trailer for The Phantom Menace over a 56K modem. But what wasn't around when the prequels were coming out, or what was maybe just starting to gain momentum as they were finishing up in 2005 with Revenge of the Sith, was social media. Which certainly isn't to say people didn't use the internet to communicate. For some, that's pretty much all they did with it, using things like chat rooms or Yahoo Messenger or whatever else it might be. I'm sure those of you who are old enough remember those things. However, the scope of things, or perhaps I should say the potential reach an individual had back then, pales in comparison to what social media offers now. Because back in the day, someone posting something in a chat room or on a forum somewhere had virtually a 0% chance of going viral and being seen by anyone beyond those actually seeking that information out in the first place. Nowadays, conceivably anyway, anyone in the world can post something on Twitter or Instagram or make a video on TikTok or YouTube that sets the internet on fire and reaches millions upon millions of viewers and can cause any number of reactions, be they positive or negative, or even change the minds or perceptions of many people who watch it. For example, I used to make posts on Star Wars forums back during the prequels all the time, or respond to them, or whatever it might be, and at most, maybe a handful of people would read them, and even less would then respond to me and interact with me. Some of them, over time, though, did become online friends, you could say, and we talked Star Wars quite a bit. And funny enough, I guess, one of the main reasons I started doing YouTube in the first place was I missed that. I missed having a relatively small community of friends to talk some Star Wars with. And so I started to make videos in an effort to recreate that in a way, to find maybe a handful of people, a few hundred would be nice, not to mention pretty amazing, who would watch or listen to what I had to say, and then they'd leave comments and I could respond and we'd have conversations and it'd be great. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd ever have 1,000 subscribers, much less over 100,000, or that I'd have videos that would be literally viewed by millions of people. That's still kind of trippy when I stop and think about it. Because the truth is, and I'll be the first one to say this, but I'm nobody special. I'm just a guy who likes Star Wars and got extremely lucky that his lifelong love and devotion and his desire to talk about it with people, which is still what drives me today, opened a sort of career path for me. And another thing that's strange about all this, and was never an intent either per se, was that to some degree and with some people, I'm sure I've influenced them or their thoughts and opinions on Star Wars. Now hopefully, by and large, that's helping them to appreciate Star Wars more, or to see some of the hidden beauty in George Lucas's incredible vision, or from anybody else who's carried it on since. But at the same time, yes, I'm sure I've turned some opinions kind of the other way, especially on the sequel trilogy. I've also then encountered what you might call the flip side of that. I've had people who have changed my mind or opinion or opened my sight to things I had never noticed before about Star Wars, which is an amazing part of doing this. But then I've also encountered people who absolutely hate me and have wished horrible things upon me for not liking the same movies the exact same way they do. And usually I take that sort of thing in stride. That's kind of part of the deal as I see it from doing this. That comes with putting your opinions out there and knowing that a large number of people are going to see them or hear them. I also understand that oftentimes the hatred sent my way comes from a place of passion for Star Wars. Not saying that makes it 100% right or justified or okay, but as a rational person, I can understand it, and I can see that sometimes hate does come from a place of love, as strange as that sounds, and that sometimes we do stupid things in the name of love. Anyway, I know I've kind of been rambling, but I think it all leads to a very interesting question about the prequels and the hatred for them, which is, where exactly does it come from? Or maybe I should ask, how do we know a large portion of the Star Wars fan base, especially those who apparently loved the original trilogy, how do we know they have so much hatred for these films? Which seems to be a very widely known or commonly held belief. And before going on, let me say that yes, obviously there are Star Wars fans who do not like the prequels, that downright hate them, and that is actually fine. Again, I get it. It comes from a place of love for the original trilogy and holding the opinion that the prequels do a, you could say, disservice to them. Now, it's not an opinion I share, but it's one I can understand someone holding. But what I'm not sure about, and that quote I read at the top from Hamill about how social media amplifies things, it got me wondering, why, again, is it such a commonly held belief that most fans hated the prequels back in the day? Where does that actually come from, or how did that come about, especially without there being social media back then? In fact, and this is rather strange when you think about it, most of the articles I saw that talked about this quote from Mark Hamill, and others that have brought up prequel hate in the past few years, they almost all talk about how it's dying down or going away. That there's now this general acceptance of them within the fan base, as if opinions have changed, and pretty radically when you think about it, considering how strong the hatred for the prequels supposedly is or was. Now, interestingly enough about these articles, not a single one seems to consider the possibility that maybe the hatred for the prequels was overblown, and that's why it seems to be dying down, because it was never that bad in the first place. Though that said, yes, I do think there are some fans that have changed their mind over the years, maybe because of the Clone Wars animated series fleshing out the story more, or maybe because they thought the sequels were worse and have come to appreciate something else Mark Hamill said about the prequels, which is that they have their own identity, they feel very different or have a very unique story when compared to the original trilogy, whereas the sequels, in many ways, just feel like a rehash of the original trilogy. There's also, of course, the fact that the kids of the prequel era have grown up now and their voices are being heard in the fan base loud and clear, and maybe even louder in a sense, considering they grew up in a world with the internet and are more likely to be using social media, I would think, than someone who maybe grew up in the age of the original trilogy. I'm sure that has something to do with the prequel hate dying down from when it was popular to hate on the prequels somewhere. And it must have been happening somewhere, right? Because again, it's a pretty commonly held belief that people and or fans all hated the prequels, even though, and I know this is going to be completely anecdotal, but for the past couple days, for fun, I've been asking pretty much everyone I know, and none of them are anything close to hardcore Star Wars fans, but they obviously know that I am. Anyway, I've been asking everyone who's ever seen them or has even heard about them what they think about the Star Wars prequels and what they think fans think about the prequels. And interestingly enough, most of them who have seen the films say they like the prequels for the most part, and that they absolutely love Revenge of the Sith. Every single one of them, in fact, said they think that film is amazing. And then when I go on to ask them what they think Star Wars fans think of the prequels, they tend to say something like, "Don't most fans hate those movies?" And when I ask, why do you think that way, they don't have the slightest clue. It's just, well, that's what I heard. However, when I go on to ask them about the sequels, I tend to get mixed reactions. Some like them, some don't, while some just thought they were okay or liked one or two of the movies but not the other ones. But when I ask them what they think Star Wars fans think about the sequels, They figure most fans liked them. In fact, most of my friends are always stunned to learn that I didn't like the sequels so much. And only a couple of them seem to be at all aware that there was any sort of split in the fan base over those films, and if they had heard about it, they thought it was only a small number of fans who didn't like them. And again, keeping in mind, this is all anecdotal, and I'm just offering up some possible answers here. This confused me because, well, hate for the sequels feels like it's everywhere on social media, at least coming from a Star Wars fan, and so you would almost think it's common knowledge that there was a division in the fan base over the sequels. Again, the perspective of a Star Wars fan skews that. And at the same time, it seems odd that they would so definitively say fans hated the prequels when there was no social media back then, and that, again, there even seems to be this coming around to the prequels lately. Until you really begin to realize, again, skewed perspective, that of course most very casual fans, or those who have only a mild interest in Star Wars, aren't following it or caring about people talking about it on social media, and at most they're seeing a headline of an article here and there. And, well, the media has, for the most part I would say, a rather positive take on the sequel trilogy, especially the first two films. And if they talk about the side of the fandom that doesn't like those movies at all in the media, they oftentimes call them a minority and label them the worst possible things and that they should be dismissed anyway. However, on the flip side, the media has never ever had a positive take on the prequels, especially back in the day when the films were actually coming out, and that is thanks in large part to Lucas and Hollywood not exactly being buddy-buddy, but let's not go too deep into that in this video. Anyway, when they reported on the films back then and throughout the years, they usually didn't say it was a minority that didn't like them. They made it sound like it was pretty much everyone, that it was a consensus. They even, over the years, and mainly to sensationalize things, they've made it sound like fans literally in some way have attacked everyone from George Lucas to Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar Binks, to Jake Lloyd, who played young Anakin in Episode 1. And though I never condone attacking someone in any manner for a movie they made or were a part of making, I've always wondered, what did fans actually do to these people? How did the fans go after, say, George Lucas? Were they protesting at Skywalker Ranch, sending him hate mail that he didn't read, writing strongly worded posts on forums he didn't know existed? Did people really go up to him when they saw him on the street and scream in his face, "You ruined my childhood"? And to be fair, Lucas has acknowledged the fan backlash before. He does know it exists, and it has seemed to bother him on some level. Though mainly what he's always seemed upset about was that people didn't like Jar Jar Binks, that they didn't understand he was there for the kids, because Star Wars, as he says, is for kids, and that they weren't happy he went overboard with digital effects. Still, this belief that he sold Lucasfilm to Disney because of fan backlash is wrong, especially when you consider that as soon as the prequels were done, he made the Clone Wars animated series. It seems like an odd move to make if you hated the fans, unless you wanted to claim he did it to spite them somehow, to give them more prequel-era stuff. Nevertheless, even when he did sell, he said he was doing it to spend time with his family, which sounds pretty legit considering he'd just gotten remarried and had a child. And again here, I'm not trying to dismiss or condone anyone who went too far with their attacks of George Lucas over the prequels, and there are those who did go too far, I'm sure. But there seems to be this commonly held belief that these type of things, or worse, were just commonplace, that roving bands or mobs of angry original trilogy fans were on the hunt for George Lucas to make him pay for the prequels. Same thing goes for Ahmed Best and what he went through. I mean, did people send him hate mail? Did they come up to him on the street and attack him somehow, verbally or otherwise? Which isn't in any way to dismiss what he went through, since he recently talked about how he contemplated suicide because of the backlash to Jar Jar. But the interesting thing is, he said it was the media backlash, not fans, that got to him. Which isn't to say no fans went too far or did anything wrong. But again, there's this belief that there was a coordinated effort from all corners of the fandom to somehow attack Ahmed Best. Even many of the articles that talked about this when he tweeted out that he almost committed suicide made it sound like that sort of thing had happened, and completely ignored the fact that he specifically said media in his post. Same sort of goes for Jake Lloyd, who has had a very troubled and difficult life since playing Anakin in The Phantom Menace. However, he's always seemed to say it was the kids at school that gave him the most hassle, Not that people were coming up to him on the street and saying whatever they might say to him, a kid who had played a role in a movie. And though again, I'm not saying it never happened at all, I'd guess or hope that most adult fans who encountered a young Jake Lloyd wouldn't be saying mean things to him. Anyway, my point here is not to say that turns out no one hated the prequels but the media. I'm sure or know plenty of fans didn't like them and still don't. But I do have to wonder just how many didn't or don't. Was prequel hate as huge as it was always made out to be, or is it a media concoction? Especially when you consider there is no social media to really get a sense of how the fandom reacted to the films back then. And what's odd is even when we do have the fandom's reaction thanks to social media today, where there is quite clearly a split over the sequels that most fans who really get into it obviously know about, the narrative around them and believed by many outside the fandom is that the movies were anywhere from fine to good to even great perhaps, and that only a few toxic trolls didn't like them and don't like them for all the wrong reasons. Which could open up a bunch of other questions about the media and how they like to control the narrative, and why they oftentimes don't like those on social media who challenge said narrative. But for now, I think I'll just end this here and ask you to share your thoughts on any and all of this, from whatever part of the fandom you come from, be that the original trilogy era, the prequels, or even a younger fan who loves the sequels, or whatever it might be. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. If you made it this far, then thanks for listening to my ramble. And like I just said, let me know what you think about all this. Was prequel hate that bad? Did most fans really hate those films? Did they go after Lucas and these actors? And if so, how exactly did they do that? Whatever you think about any or all of this, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thank you for watching.